Today we're going to talk about the rise of the probability sample, how it rose to dominate survey research following the 1940s, and how it displaced the use of quota sampling in public opinion surveys. While the pollsters dominated public opinion surveys, and especially election horse race polling, new developments were emerging in government and academics that would lead to another major change in survey research, the rise of the dominance of probability sampling. We saw earlier that government, especially the Department of Agriculture and the Census, began to develop methods for probability sampling by the late 1930s. These included the earliest unemployment surveys in 1933 and 34 in what was then called the Trial Census of Unemployment. Early efforts at probability sampling of farms in 1938 came from Iowa State University's Statistical Laboratory, which drew a random sample of 800 Iowa farms. The Department of Agriculture in this period continued to develop its research capabilities. By 1939, the Bureau of Agricultural Economics was charged with planning and research. Within that unit, Rensis Likert, who we saw earlier as the creator of the Likert scale, was hired as the director in 1939. The organization Likert headed was called the Division of Program Surveys, and its mission was to conduct surveys of farmers' experiences with and opinions about the U.S. Department of Agriculture and its many programs. Program surveys had a tradition of informal interviews with farmers rather than structured questionnaires. You can imagine the interviewers wandering out into the field with the farmer and just kind of chatting about how things are going and what the crops look like and what they're planting. Ironically, given Likert's association with the closed-ended Likert scale, he nevertheless defended the open-ended, non-standardized question wording practice that was common in the division at the time, as did, by the way, others such as the sociologist Paul Lazarsfeld. However, the tradition of the interviewers was so unstructured that Likert felt the need for some form of constraint on interviewers. At the very least, he needed to remind them that biased and leading questions were not really what the division had in mind. To illustrate this point, instructions were sent to interviewers that included the following as an example of how not to ask a question. Mr. Jones, I noticed the new terraces in that field of yours over there. Am I right in believing that you like them very much? Not only because they keep your soil from washing, but also because the water they hold back will increase your crop yield? That such a leading question had to be provided as a negative example is perhaps testimony to the concerns about just how unstructured the existing interviews had been. After arriving at program surveys, Likert sought to expand its role, arguing that the problems of agriculture should be seen in a larger national and international context. But to expand meant partnering with other government agencies. The limited budget that was available to Likert through the Agriculture Department was barely sufficient to sustain the surveys that he had to do for the department, let alone allow expansion into other, perhaps more interesting areas. One revealing example, both of the sophistication that was developing in the program surveys and of Likert's readiness to react to opportunities, came on December 7th, 1941. Within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, program surveys interviewers throughout the South were called to a meeting in Memphis, Tennessee. Many of them had to drive throughout the night to reach Memphis in time for the meeting. There they were briefed, put on an airplane, and flown to Los Angeles to conduct the first survey of public response to the Pearl Harbor attack. By December 14th, program surveys had prepared a report on the immediate public response to the beginning of World War II. That report was distributed widely in the government, well beyond the confines of the Agriculture Department. boosting Lickard's claims that while program surveys might be in the Agriculture Department, it was capable of addressing far broader questions. During the war, program surveys conducted extensive research for the Office of Price Administration, the War Production Board, and most importantly for the Treasury and the Federal Reserve Board, including important surveys of public willingness to buy war bonds, a critical element in the financing of the war. World War II also brought a tremendous influx of social scientists into the government. They studied economic issues and public morale and soldiers, as well as making estimates of crop production. To mention just two of the most important major efforts, Samuel Stauffer's 4-volume study, The American Soldier, was an exhaustive study of members of the military mobilized for World War II, what their attitudes were towards the military service, to how they were treated as soldiers, to conditions that they lived under. All of this to develop a better understanding of how soldiers responded to the conditions of military service. Another important survey was the Strategic Bombing Survey, a truly unusual and innovative survey. It interviewed civilians in Europe and Japan, more or less immediately after U.S. forces occupied their territory. Respondents were interviewed in their native languages, and the survey sought to measure the impact on civilian morale and regime support that was affected by the Allied strategic bombing campaigns. Samples were drawn based on stratification that included the intensity of bombing of the subject populations, along with other variables. This was used to address long-term American strategy for the question of whether strategic bombing in fact reduced civilian morale, or as was widely claimed in the case of Britain, where it was believed that the Blitz actually increased morale rather than decreased it. So the Strategic Bombing Survey was deliberately connected to the question of future U.S. strategic bombing practice. During the war, there was considerable progress in the area of probability sampling. The public opinion pollsters continued to rely on quota samples based on pragmatic considerations, but without benefit of theoretical justification. In contrast, area probability sampling was beginning to provide a sound theoretical foundation for the sampling of national populations. Much of the innovation in theory and practice came from the Bureau of the Census, and much of that was related to measurement of the workforce and of unemployment.